Thank you, Matthias. My name is Doug Stevenson. I am a developer advocate with the Firebase team. I'm here with Rachel and Johnny. Where's Rachel? There's Rachel. Wave more. Hey, and where's Johnny? I saw him back there. Oh, there he is. He's around the corner. Yeah. So we're with the Firebase team. We're having tons of fun here in Hamburg. We're really enjoying the city. So much fun to be here, just with you all and having fun in the city. And I'm so excited. I can't contain my excitement. And I like Firebase too. I like to talk about Firebase. Firebase is Google's mobile platform, so if you're building a mobile app, there's a really good chance that Firebase has something in there for you. Of course, if you're participating in the hackathon today, you kind of have to use Firebase. That's one of the basic rules. Firebase now has, what is this? What's this count? 20? There's 5 times 4, so 20 different products. Our graphic designer probably loves the fact that they split up nicely into develop pillar and grow pillar with everything the same dimension. I'm a very neat and tidy and organized person, so I like this new layout. Some of the things here are old. They've been around for a long time. Some things are new, so I'll point out the things that are new. So if you followed us at the Firebase Summit in Amsterdam, some of these products are brand new. I would like to talk first. Well, actually, it's worth noting the mobile platforms we support are Android and iOS. They're first-class support, so everything works on iOS and Android, except for Test Lab, which is Android only. We support web where it makes sense. So if you're building PWAs or web apps, many of the Firebase products work OK. And we had a lot of demand from game developers, so we recently added Unity and C++ support. So if you're building a Unity game, a lot of Firebase products work there too. We have 1 million developers using Firebase. I think this number actually, this slide is old. I think it's more like 1.3 million. So it's, we have very much up and to the right growth. We love that. We hope that you would also find Firebase helpful and help us keep pushing that up. Because the more people we have using Firebase, the greater community support that you all get from each other. So our support channels tend to get better as more people get involved with them. You may have also recently heard that Fabric joined forces with Firebase. So Fabric is another mobile SDK platform. And so I'll talk a little bit more about how Fabric is becoming integrated into Firebase. So there's, I think, 2 or 3 things that are worth noting. But we are definitely being very intentional about how we bring Fabric components into Firebase. We don't want to pull the carpet out of underneath anyone. We want to make sure everyone has a good experience. So over time, more and more Fabric will be involved in Firebase. So the first cluster of components I'd like to talk about is part of the develop pillar. So these are the ones you'll probably use the most during the hackathon. So we have database solutions, authentication, cloud functions, which is like serverless backend computing, cloud storage, which is just very scalable file storage, and hosting. I'll talk about these first. These are probably the most important ones for the hackathon. So Realtime Database, this is where Firebase originally came from. So Firebase used to be just Realtime Database hosting and authentication. So a lot of times when people say Firebase, they actually mean Realtime Database. Firebase is now a platform. So when I talk about Firebase, I'm talking about all 20 of those things. But so, colloquially, sometimes people call Realtime Database Firebase. So if you're not familiar with it, it's cloud-hosted NoSQL database. So there's NoSQL queries. You could think of it as basically one giant JSON document, or sometimes we say hierarchical key-value pairs. You can structure it any way you want. So it's just one big document. You impose your own ordering and structure on it. There's not necessarily a right or wrong way to do it, but there are best practices. And if you're using client libraries, there's automatic synchronization and conflict resolution. So clients just write into the database. You don't have to worry about synchronization. You don't even necessarily care. Firebase just does the right thing. You just use the client libraries in a way that makes sense for your app. And you do access it directly from the app. So you don't go through a middleware. There's no REST API. There is a REST API, but you don't generally use it. Generally what you use is the Android native and the iOS native client libraries. Now, Realtime Database is special because it really enables highly collaborative apps. So this is kind of an illustration of you have one client writing in, and that change gets immediately distributed to all the other clients that are listening at that location. So Firebase is kind of weird because you don't really, you query it, but at the same time you're listening for results. So if that result set changes, you get a callback. So anytime one client changes the data, all the other clients that are listening there automatically get those updates. So you can create very sort of magical apps, apps that update themselves automatically. You're not polling it, you're just receiving results, and that's kind of unique. The other thing that's unique about Real-Time Database is it accounts for the fact that sometimes mobile clients are offline, right? You drive into a tunnel, you go downstairs, you lose your connectivity temporarily, and that's okay. You can still read and write the database. It's just all those writes get queued up. Then when you finally get connectivity back, they flush to the server and update all the other clients. So you generally don't know or don't care if you have connectivity. You just keep reading and writing as if you're offline or online. Firebase handles all that behind the scenes. Some things that are new in Firebase over the past few months, we recently upped the amount of concurrent connections for paying users. So it used to be, I think the limit was something like 10,000 concurrent connections, and if you needed more, you had to call support, and we would make sure your app was architected okay. We've made some backend improvements, and now everyone who's a paying customer gets 100,000 concurrent connections. There's also a profiler to help you figure out, are your queries optimized correctly? So that's something that's part of the command line tools now. Another new thing, this is very recent, is you can now have multiple databases per project. So if you create a Firebase project, it used to be you could have one and exactly one database. If you wanted a second database, you had to create a second project, and then you had to build your app to access both projects. And that was kind of a pain. And so what we've done now is we've made it so that you can have multiple databases in one project. Now, why would you want that? Why would you need multiple databases? Well, it turns out Firebase Real-Time Database does have scaling limitations, so it's gated by the number of concurrent writes that you're doing. So I can't remember what it is. It's like 1,000 writes per second. Johnny, do you know? Is it? What was that? Oh, okay, about 1,000 writes per second. So if you have a very write-heavy load, you'd have to shard your database among multiple databases. So now if you want to do that sharding, you can keep it all within the same database, which is much more convenient. Now there's another new thing called Cloud Firestore. This is also a NoSQL real-time database. And you might be wondering, well, why do we need two? Why don't we just have real-time database? Why do we have Cloud Firestore? Well, Firestore is a little bit different. It's similar to real-time database in that you still have synchronization and security, just like real-time database. But you have now a more implicit way of structuring your database. So instead of one big document, now you have collections, each with documents, and those documents can have sub-collections, and those sub-collections can have sub-documents in them. So it's a little bit more ordered. It's more intuitive. It's basically the way that people were using real-time database, but it provides more structure for you to think about how you want to structure your documents. The one big thing that was missing from real-time database is multiple where clauses. So if you wanted to sort and filter your data, with real-time database you had to pick one key and only one key for a query, which is okay, but you'd have to structure your data in kind of a strange way. You'd have to build around that limitation. Now with Cloud Firestore, you can have much more expressive querying. You can query on multiple keys, and that opens up all kinds of new possibilities for your client apps. And it's effortless scaling. So I mentioned before, real-time database had write limitations, so 1,000 writes per second. With Cloud Firestore, we don't have that anymore. It scales up globally. Like, you don't have to worry about sharding your database. You don't have to worry about the number of concurrent writes. It just happens automatically, which is pretty amazing, right? The fact that you can scale millions and maybe billions of documents without having to make any changes or scale your app or do anything different on the client side is pretty amazing. So that's your storage option. Most client apps probably want to get their users logged in and identified, right? You want to do something per user. You want to have per user storage, per user identification. So Firebase Authentication is what you can use for that. It's standard account management. It supports email and password authentication, Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, anonymous login, which is important for things like games where you want to get people into your game and playing quickly, but you don't want to lose their progress, so you can do anonymous authentication for that. Phone number authentication, and I bolded that because that came from digits, which was part of Fabric. So we've taken digits out of Fabric and started to move it into Firebase. So now you can do phone number authentication just like any other Firebase form of authentication. And if you have your own identity management system on the back end, you can write a bridge between that. So whatever you have in your own company, you can use Firebase authentication to authenticate against that custom auth system. And maybe even more importantly is there's an out-of-the-box UI for managing your login flows. And that's actually one really difficult thing. Like if you've ever tried to do a login flow system, it's quite difficult. There's a lot of considerations. There's an open source tool that you can use called Firebase UI, and that manages all of that for you. So you just add the component into your app, let it deal with the UI. You can customize it a little bit, but it handles all of the sort of nagging details of how do you get users into your app. So Cloud Functions for Firebase. This is one that's very close to me. I'm actually the developer advocate that's responsible for telling everyone about Cloud Functions, but I'm not going to do that today, unfortunately. That's going to be Johnny around the corner. He has a lot to say about Cloud Functions and about Cloud Firestore. So after this talk, he's going to say more. You have a demo, right? You're going to do some live coding? Okay, that's going to be awesome. Can't wait for that demo fail. So we'll get back to that later. Firebase hosting you can use if you're building a web app. So it's basically serving static assets. So your HTML, your JavaScript, your CSS, any sort of static content, you can deploy that into hosting, and it gets distributed to a worldwide CDN. So no matter where your customers are in the world, they have very direct and fast access to your static web assets. When you sign up, you get a free SSL certificate. That's pretty awesome, I think. Back when I did web development back in the 90s, handling SSL and provisioning your own certificate was kind of a pain. Here, all you have to do is say, I want one, and then you get it, and SSL is just on all the time, so you don't have to worry about that. You can attach custom domains to it, so whatever your domain name is, and we handle subdomains as well, you can attach those all to your project. And now, this is, ever since we had Cloud Functions released, now you can proxy some of your requests to hosting into Cloud Functions. So Cloud Functions can have HTTP triggers, and now you can send some of your URLs over to Cloud Functions for dynamic serving. So this used to be just static, now it's static and dynamic if you're hooked up with Cloud Functions, and I like that a lot. Cloud storage for Firebase is a massively scalable file storage solution. So this is the same product as Google Cloud Storage. If you know GCS, you know Firebase. They're kind of the same thing. But what Firebase adds onto that is a mobile SDK for clients. So now when you write code, you can, user uploaded content is what this is for. So if you have people taking pictures of themselves and uploading them to storage, this is what it's perfect for. And you don't have to deal with GCS directly. You deal with the client library, and the client library is basically upload file. You say, upload file, and it happens. The other beautiful thing about that is it handles poor connectivity. So if your clients go offline and they get cut off in the middle of a transfer, you don't have to retry the whole thing. It knows where it left off, and it will do intelligent resumes. Saves your clients bandwidth, saves time. It's definitely a good thing for everyone. And the new thing here is that now you can have multiple storage buckets attached to a project. So not that storage buckets don't scale, they do, but sometimes you just want to organize things differently. And now you can have multiple buckets, and you can choose which region for which bucket you want, so you can move your files closer to your customers. Oh, that's interesting. I'm going to have to fix that. So that's those first 6 components. You'll definitely use those in the hackathon. There's another 4 components, which I also like a lot. They're for maintaining the stability of your app. So we have Firebase Test Lab, and that's for Android only, Performance, Crashlytics, and crash reporting, and I'll go over those real fast. Firebase Test Lab is a tool that you use during development to test your apps. So you can test your apps and now games on popular Android devices before you ship it to your clients. So one of the things we say in Test Lab is test in the lab, not on your users. You don't want to push something that you haven't run through Test Lab. Now you might be wondering, oh, how do I actually test my app? Well, I jumped ahead of myself. When you run a test, you will get logs, screenshots, and performance indicators at the end of the test run. So for all of the devices and all of the configurations that you choose, all of that will happen automatically, and a report will be generated at the end, and you'll have all this at your disposal. The logs go back all the way to device boot. So if you know Android, there's a lot that can go on during device boot. And so sometimes it's nice to have those diagnostics available. For writing tests, so who here does Android? Okay, a few. If you have tested your app, you know that you write tests in Espresso or UI Automator. So you can write those tests, what we call instrumented tests, and deploy those to Test Lab. So now you can run your entire suite of tests against dozens of devices if you want. But I'm going to admit, testing is not exactly something you want to do. Like, who here loves testing? Okay, there's always like 2 people in the room who love testing, and then like everyone's just like, I don't waste my time. And I sympathize with both. So if you don't like, well, even if you do like testing, but if you don't like testing, there's something called a robo test. And what it will do is it'll launch your app and find buttons and like navigate your app. And you might be thinking, oh, this sounds like Monkey Runner. And it's not exactly like Monkey Runner. Monkey Runner is random. It just sort of like sends events at your app and hopes that it triggers something. Robo's special because it actually understands the structure of your app. It looks at widgets. It finds buttons. It tries to do a deep and broad scan of your app. So it's basically, you can think of it like your first beta user poking around in your app. And so you don't write any code for this. In fact, you can configure it for things like automatic login. So if you have email and password-based login, you can tell it, hey, when you get to this screen, fill out this form, do this query. That really helps increase the coverage of your app without having to write a line of code. Crash reporting. So I'm proud to say that I wrote the first version of crash reporting. I was hired in as a software engineer, and I switched to a DA. So crash reporting is a standard, Firebase Crash Reporting is a standard crash reporting tool. See crashes and the impact on your users. There's drill downs into version and OS. I'm going through this kind of quickly, and you'll see why in a bit. Crash reporting is integrated with Firebase Analytics, so there's a two-way integration. Crashes in crash reporting become analytics events. So as your users are generating an event stream, a crash can become part of that. Likewise, when you view a crash in crash reporting, all of your analytics events that had happened for that user are in the log. So that gives you a better context for what happened up to the point of the crash. And I think that's really great. But you might be wondering, well, there's Firebase Crashlytics, another crash reporting tool that came from Fabric, right? This is maybe the most popular Fabric offering was Crashlytics. And you might be wondering, why do I have crash reporting and Crashlytics? Well, there's a transition period. So Crashlytics right now is the primary crash reporter for Firebase. So what we recommend is if you want a crash reporter, go here first, because this is going to have all the best support for all of our crash reporting features going forward. It has intelligent grouping and prioritization of your crashes. So it will tell you at a glance what are your most critical problems, what you should do first to fix them. There's also real-time alerts, so you can get an email if something happens. And on top of that, you can integrate with Cloud Functions. So if your app crashes, you can write a trigger in Cloud Functions. So you're writing JavaScript code to deal with the information from that crash. You could turn around and send an FCM for yourself, or send an email, or do something in addition to the real-time alerts. And I think that's pretty cool. Now, you might be wondering, what does Firebase Crash Reporting do that Crashlytics doesn't do? Well, that's the analytics integration. When Firebase Crashlytics comes fully out of beta, it will do everything that Firebase Crash Reporting does. And eventually, Firebase Crash Reporting will get sunsetted, and we want everyone to use Firebase Crashlytics going forward. Firebase Performance Monitoring is a tool. Actually, I'm very close to this one, too, because at the startup I was at prior to joining Google, I worked on a product that became eventually Firebase Performance. So I could talk about this all day long. And I did the Android SDK. So I did all the stuff that, if you know how performance monitoring works, is it does this, on Android at least, it does a compile time look at all of your classes, and it instruments all of your classes and adds code in there to do this measuring and monitoring. On iOS, it uses method swizzling, which is a whole different thing, and I don't fully understand that. But all that's to say, it will instrument your production application. So you're monitoring your app in production. So Firebase Test Lab is for before production. Firebase Performance is in production, and there's like negligible overhead. So it's kind of like a no-brainer. Put this in, write no lines of code, and you start getting metrics information. It can automatically analyze network requests. So for every HTTP request your app makes, we will record that and aggregate that among all the other HTTP requests, and you can get a report on which ones are fast or slow. If you're using a REST API, it'll wildcard all of the data bits. So if your URL is something like /users/user ID, we'll figure out that there's a user ID after users and then put a little asterisk there. And so you can see the aggregated stats for that entire cluster of requests. You can also do custom traces. So if there's a segment of code that you're really curious about how well it performs, you can write a little bit of code. You can create a trace, and you can start the trace and stop the trace whenever you want. On Android, there's also an annotation. So you can annotate a method to see how well that method is performing and write no lines of code. It's just an annotation. So if you're really curious, if you know there's a performance problem and you want to know how bad it is, create a custom trace for that and get the actual data from your actual users on their actual devices, not on a fast, local network device. Performance never seems to be a problem when you're working on your office Wi-Fi, right, where the servers may be sitting right next to you. It's different for your users in the wild, so you need to measure that differently. All right, so that's all of the developed products. So these are the things that we say are useful for building out the functionality of your app and maintaining its stability. And we have this other pillar called Grow. So this is about getting a hold of new users and keeping existing users in your app and engaged. So I'd like to talk about Grow. So Google Analytics for Firebase is a mobile-centric analytics solution from Firebase. So like I said, it's designed for mobile apps. If you know Google Analytics, the original one from years and years and years ago, that's for web. And what we found is that web apps behave differently than mobile apps. Mobile apps can't really use a web app analytics solution. So Google Analytics for Firebase is dedicated to mobile apps. So it's specific to Android and iOS. It's event and user-centric. So we have a very strong sense of the events that are streaming through your app, and we tie them to an individual user, but it's all anonymized. So we know we know the concept of a user, but all of their PII or personally identifiable information is all stripped from the results. This connects across Firebase. So you've already seen, you've seen that Google Analytics connects to crash reporting, Google Analytics also has its tentacles in other parts of Firebase as well. And so this creates a lot of opportunity to get more information than you would if you were cobbling together a solution from different analytics providers. And it is free and unlimited. So if you have a very popular app and you're generating hundreds, thousands, and millions of events, that's fine. We will handle that, and you will not ever pay anything for that. That's actually one thing that we're very adamant about, is everything that you have available that doesn't cost anything will continue to cost nothing. There will be no billing surprises, no matter how popular your app becomes. There are two interesting things that are fairly, well, I won't say fairly recent. These were released last year at the Firebase Summit. There's something called StreamView, and StreamView gives you a live look into how your app is being used across the world. So you have this map view, and you can look around the map and see what users are doing in your app. The other cool thing about this is you can take this user snapshot down here. What a user snapshot does is it will randomly select one of your users and show you the event stream that's coming from them. So you can actually like kind of look in and see, how is someone actually using my app? And that's kind of like fun to see. Again, all of the PII is gone from that. You don't know who they are. You maybe know where they are in the world, but you get to sort of look and see what an actual user might be doing. The other thing that's useful for development is debug view. So if you have an app that you're working on and you have an emulator or an actual device in front of you, you might want to figure out what the events that are going on that are being generated by that app, the one that you have in your hand that you're developing. So what debug view, it allows you to associate a device with the data in the console. So now you can use the console to see the stream of events that your app has generated. That's important because when you're developing, you kind of you don't get feedback on the series of events that are generated. So now you can see the actual series of events. You can make sure your app is sending them the way that you expect, and you can see it right here in the console. The other thing that Analytics does very well is it will export to BigQuery. So like I said, Google Analytics for Firebase is free and unlimited, but there's limited access to the data that you can get in there. If you want access to all the data, you simply export it to BigQuery, and now you can tie that up with other analytics solutions. So now you can cross-query between Google Analytics for web and Google Analytics for Firebase, or whatever other data you have. Now you can do complicated joins, you can create tables, you can visualize your data much easier than you could just in the Firebase console if you have very custom queries that you want to perform. Okay, Firebase Cloud Messaging. This used to be Google Cloud Messaging. This is kind of an old product. Then it got sort of merged into the Firebase console. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically a zero-cost cross-platform messaging solution, meaning you can send notifications to your app, you can wake your app, have it do something, have it show a notification to the user. You write minimal code to do that. One thing that a lot of developers are using now is they're using it to create notifications to drive user interaction. And all that means is notify someone, get them back in your app. Now, I feel strongly, don't spam your users. Don't use FCM to send people junk messages. Please, please don't do that. Send them helpful messages. Don't send them crappy messages. And with cloud messaging, you can target users. So in the Firebase console, now you can just type a message directly to one user or to an audience defined by Analytics. So I didn't mention Analytics has a concept of an audience, which is a group of users who have something in common based on their behavior. So you could have everyone who ever made an in-app purchase. That's an audience. Now you can target them with messaging. So you can say, I see you've made a purchase. You might be interested in something else, and that might actually be helpful for them. And this point I actually just said, yeah. So you actually don't have to write code to deliver messages to your app. You can do it all from the console, and the SDK automatically receives those and displays those and launches your app. One thing that's very new, and I think this is in the past couple weeks, is now you can do what's called platform overrides, meaning if you want to send a message to your Android and iOS users, you might want that message to be slightly different. So you might say, go to the App Store if you're an iOS. If the user's on iOS, you might want to say, go to the Play Store if the user's on Android. Well, prior to that, prior to this platform overrides feature, you had to send everyone the same message. There was no bifurcation, no splitting based on OS. Now you can. So your message payload now can contain two different messages, one for each platform. Remote config is kind of the Swiss Army knife of components. There's a lot you can do here. The easiest way to think about it is it's server-side variables, or you can think of it as a giant hash table with name-value pairs. Now, how is a giant hash table stored on a server actually useful? It seems like that's kind of limited, but there's more to it than that. With remote config, you can change the behavior and appearance of your app without deploying. So the idea is you use the remote config SDK to fetch server variables from time to time. Those are fresh, right? You always have a fresh copy. So now if you want to do something like hide a feature behind a flag, you put a flag, you maybe make it false when you launch your app, then you can turn it on without publishing simply by changing a remote config variable. This is super handy. You can also do this to turn that feature off if it's crashing. I like that one. So this is actually helpful for app stability, because if you're anxious about launching a new feature, put it behind a remote config flag. Turn it off if it's actually crashing, and get that bad code out of your app, and then take time to fix it and redeploy. This is also integrated with analytics. So I mentioned before, analytics has a concept of an audience. Well, now you can target remote config variables to a particular audience. So if you have, again, an audience of people who are big spenders in your app, maybe you give them a VIP experience. You do something a little bit special for them. You can do that pretty easily with remote config. Now what you have in the console is the ability to specify 2 different, or maybe 3 different values for one variable based on the audience where the user has slotted. And there's a new feature called A/B testing. Now, with remote config at launch, you could do A/B testing, but it was kind of hard to set up an experiment, and it was difficult to assess the results. What you can do with A/B testing now is set up a very formal experiment. There's a new UI where you can set up an experiment. You can say what the different parameters are. You can say what the different, like how many, what percentage of users should be in each experiment. So maybe you're testing, I don't know, you have a game and maybe you're testing number of lives in the game, right? So one group might be 3, one group might be 4, and one group might be 5. So you're testing, actually that's ABC testing, but the point is you can look at that and see which users actually have better retention or longer gameplay, and you can make informed decisions based on actual user data, not just guessing about it. So this is super handy. The results of the experiment are very easily consumed in the dashboard rather than trying to set up like funnels and analytics, which no one really likes to do. Okay, Firebase dynamic links. So if you're all mobile developers, who is familiar with the concept of a deep link? Deep link, okay, so a handful of people, right? So deep links are like a URL that launch your mobile app and send the user directly into some part of your app. A dynamic link takes that concept and adds to it. So you can customize different user experience with a single URL, so that URL can have different attributes associated with it. And that's not too uncommon for a deep link, but this works across platforms. So now you have one URL that works on Android and iOS. So you don't have to worry about having one URL for each different platform. And that's because a lot of this is driven on the server. So the server is making an assessment about the client and what should actually happen from that. And the other thing it does really well that that deep links typically don't do is it survives app installation. So if you've ever tried to send a user to your app with a deep link and they don't have it installed, then they have to go off to the store, they have to download the app, they have to launch the app, and now the deep link is essentially gone. You've lost all that context. With dynamic links, that actually survives the app installation process. So if the user clicks on a dynamic link, they have to install, that's fine. When they launch the app, now you write a little bit of code in there to say, if the user came from a dynamic link, now route them to the part of the app that you want them to go to. So that's a pretty big win for users who don't have your app already installed. And again, there's analytics insights. So every click on a dynamic link essentially becomes more statistics and more analytics for your consumption. Firebase Invites is built on top of dynamic links, and what it is basically a UI for app sharing. Now, we all know the best marketing out there is word-of-mouth marketing, right? You want your happy users to refer other happy users. You don't want, and it's free, right? You don't pay for that. Happy users are your greatest advocates because they're basically they're basically telling everyone about your great app without you having to pay them, right? So Firebase Invites is basically that. There is a UI, so all you have to do is invoke the UI. So I'm an Android developer. All you have to do is start activity, and then off you go into the Invites UI, and then you can add people through either email or SMS, and the message will go to them, and they can click the link in the email or the SMS, and then go install your app. The UI will reach into the contact book. So for Android, well, I don't know about iOS. On Android, it will access contacts and populate the UI based on what it sees in your contact list. So again, you write no code. You don't have to know anything about this. All you know is that your users will be able to share their app with their friends and family. And it's built on dynamic links. So the email and the SMS that gets sent out to users is itself a dynamic link. So now you can do things like track engagement, you can get some analytics, you have basically all of the power of a dynamic link, but wrapped up into an Invites UI. app indexing. So this is another, actually kind of an old product that was part of Google Play Services and became part of Firebase. It integrates with Google Search. So now when someone does a search in Google, you can have your app essentially be a proposal or something that they could click on as a result of doing a Google search. So if you're searching for kitten memes and your app says, well, I'm all about kitten memes, then you can basically show up in Google search results. It will index your app content. So you write a little bit of code to say what users are doing in your app. And that creates what's called a local index. And that local index basically becomes part of what Google Search will use when it's trying to figure out if your app is a good option. You can also improve your search ranking this way. So as users use your app on your mobile app, that boosts your web search ranking, which is kind of weird. Like, how would a mobile app change your web search? Well, that's the way it's wired up. So if you write those little bits of code in your app to indicate what users are doing in your app, now you have more visibility in Google Search, which might actually be better than a search in the Play Store, because there's, I don't know, millions of apps out there. How do you stand out? Well, use app indexing, and now you have the possibility of showing up in a Google search. On Android, there's a very special feature, and it's called local search index. So if your user is using Google Search on the device, so they're searching for something using the Android Google Search app, your app can appear in search results right there on the device. And in fact, if you're tracking what the user's doing in your app, so say you have a shopping app and the user's looking for shoes, and you have all these things in your index about shoes. Now, if they're using the Google Search app, they search for shoes, now your app will show up and it'll remind the user that they were looking at shoes in your shopping app. So now you can re-engage with your users much more quickly and directly than you could without this, basically. All right, AdWords. I'm sure everyone here knows AdWords, right? It's, you're basically putting ads in your app to make money. Oh, actually, no, I'm sorry. It's the other way. It's you can create ads, ad campaigns to help drive traffic to your app. So now what you're doing is you're hooking into all of these Google properties to promote your app. It works on Android and iOS. You have audience targeting, and there's conversion tracking and optimization. To be honest, I don't know much about AdWords, so I'm going to skip over this. This actually is not too helpful for a hackathon, but if you're trying to get your app well known out there, do consider using AdWords for that. And then there's AdMob, that's placing ads in your app. This is pretty handy, obviously, to make money. One relatively new thing in this is that you can do what's called native ads. So, ads might not match the look and feel of your app, and that can be kind of jarring. And, users know there's that section of your screen that's not quite right? It's an ad. It's obviously an ad. With AdMob, one thing you can do is use CSS to make the ad suit or match the style of your app. So if you have a scrolling list of things, now you can show an ad in the middle of all your other content. It's a little more of a seamless experience. And I imagine that users might be more likely to notice it and click on it. And the last thing I'd like to talk about, oh, my emojis didn't render. That's sad. It looks so much better on my screen. So Firebase Predictions is another new product that was announced at the Firebase Summit. It's basically what happens when you apply machine learning to your analytics data. It answers the question, who will churn or spend? So right now you can see that there's a group of users, some of which are happy, they're spenders, some of which are unhappy, they might uninstall or leave your app, and then you have users who are not spending but they're not necessarily leaving your app. Now you can group these people together. And what you can do is use Firebase notifications to send a message to the people who are about to churn and say, hey, I've noticed that you stopped playing my game. Would you like to try again? Maybe here's a special promotion. So it's a way to sort of reward your active users for active engagement and also bring potentially churning users back into your app as well. And you don't write any lines of code for this. Predictions just tells you this based on analytics data that it's collecting. You can also tie in with remote config. So now you can have a remote config parameter split between churning users, non-churning users, and paying users. So if you want to change the behavior and appearance of your app based on what predictions think the user is going to do, that's really easy now. Okay. This is so who uses Fastlane? Is anyone here? Okay, a couple people. Yeah. So do you do iOS or Android apps? iOS. Okay, both. All right. Yeah. So this is premium support. Well, this came from an iOS primarily solution. Now it's available for Android. Fastlane helps you do things like build your app, construct your Play Store presence, publish your an Android APK. I guess what is it on Android? IPA or iOS? I think it's IPA. Anyway, this streamlines the release process for your app. So this is something that is going to become more and more integrated into Firebase, but right now it's still its own standalone project. And if you want to learn more about Firebase, so we have our homepage, we have a lot of open source on Git, so we've actually open sourced all of our iOS libraries, all of our admin SDKs. I mentioned Firebase UI earlier, which is our drop-in solution for authentication. So now you can actually look at the code and contribute to them. There's a Udacity course called Firebase in a Weekend, and it is literally learning Firebase in a weekend. There's video tutorials and exercises you can do. There's a ton of YouTube videos. You might see me on there because I make some of those videos. So there's pretty much all of the Firebase products now have some sort of video tutorial. So if you prefer that style of learning, please check out our YouTube channel. And we also have a Slack community. So if you just want to chit-chat with other Firebase users, a lot of people come in here and ask really intense questions, and that can be, that gets met with mixed results. But if you just want to chit-chat, like I'm on there all the time, if you want to talk, if you have like maybe broad open-ended questions, you want to know what other people are doing with Firebase, this is a great place to go. We also have an alpha program. So if you're interested in testing out new Firebase products, go to this URL, fill out the form. I can't make any personal guarantees that you'll be accepted or rejected or how that works, but we do have something called an early access program. So new products, new features, we'll get through, we'll initially go through an EAP program where you can try it out, you can send us feedback, you can say if it does what you think it should do, send us bug reports. We definitely like people to be in our alpha program. And that's Firebase. That's a lot there, right? So then 20 products, probably half of which I would really hope to see in your hackathon projects. Thank you. Does anyone have? No one interrupt. So Johnny's going to speak next, but if anyone has any general questions about Firebase as a platform or anything that I just talked about, except for Cloud Functions, because Johnny's going to answer those. Yeah.
I just have one question about the real-time database.
Oh, hold on a second. We'll get you a mic for the people watching at home.
Thank you. So I have one question about the real-time database. You said a lot of advantages of moving to Firestore. Which are the advantages of staying with the real-time database? Okay. Why would a developer want to stay?
Yeah, that's a good question. So right now Firestore is in beta, which meaning there's no SLA. We don't give you a guarantee about uptime. That said, we are pushing people in that direction for whom that might be interesting. So it's just about, at some level, it's your tolerance for risk. So real-time database is production. We have an SLA. Firestore is not. I'm trying to think what real-time database does well that Firestore does not. It has presence management. So with real-time database, you can like trigger something to happen in the database as a user comes online or offline. So there's a special location you can listen to, whether you can know whether or not they're connected. You can set up when someone loses their connection, you can trigger something to happen in the database, which you could then trigger a cloud function. So you can do things a little more intelligently about where the user or what the user's doing at that moment. So if you're a Firestore user, we say still use real-time database for presence management. Maybe, Johnny, do you know, you're a little closer to Firestore than I am. Do you have any thoughts about that? Why you would want to stay with real-time database instead of Firestore?
Hello? Okay.
Hello.
Cool, yeah. In general, yeah, Firestore does have a lot of advantages over the real-time database. The advantage that the real-time database has is it does provide a lot of flexibility in how you structure your data. In Firestore, you're required to put your data into documents and group them as collections. And in the real-time database, it is just a single JSON blob. And if you're building something like games and you sort of have a game state that isn't really something that you'd express as a collection, then the real-time database may make more sense.
Yeah, and I think maybe something specific on that front is in Firestore, if you want to know about changes that are happening, you have to listen to an entire document at a time. Whereas in real-time database, you can listen to a very specific field. So you're not bound to listen to potentially many changes. So on Firestore, if you want to listen to a particular field, you have to listen to the entire document, then figure out if the field you were interested in actually changed. So that's one thing that, and I don't know if the Firestore team is ever going to give us the ability to do that, but that's maybe one thing, an advantage that you might find in real-time database.
Thank you.
Yep. Anyone else?
Here.
Yeah.
If you want to use Google indexing or Firebase indexing, I don't know. In the beginning, it was Google indexing, and if I wanted to use it, I had to add some meta tags in my websites to as an equivalent to my app. Is this necessary after all?
Yeah,
So-
if you're trying to link your web app to your mobile app, yes,
Yeah.
you still need this sort of verification phase so that Google can be certain that your mobile app is actually associated to your web app.
Yes.
That said, on Android, local app indexing doesn't require that. So
Yeah.
if you're creating a local index of all the things that the users search for and done
Yeah.
in your app, that doesn't require any linkage to a website. But
Yeah.
again, that's only on Android, not on iOS.
Yeah, okay. And if I want to improve my Google search rankings to without having a website at all, is there any benefit of using Google indexing?
I think again, just on Android.
Yes,
local link that. But yeah,
okay.
if you don't have a website, if there's no linkage between your mobile app
Yeah,
and your
yeah.
web presence, then
So it's-
yeah, it's not much you can do.
Yeah, thank you.
Wait, we have a quick. Oh, here we go. Yeah, just throw it. I was at one conference. They gave us a little pillow box, and I would literally throw it out in the audience.
Thanks
It was
for
tons of
this
fun.
presentation. My question about the relationship between the Google Cloud and the Firebase. What I know that Firebase is platform based on Google Cloud. So I use Google Messaging before, and now the Fire Messaging. So my app runs with Google Cloud Messaging, but should I transfer my backend to Firebase or Fire
So
backend?
the question is, you're currently using GCM, Google
Yes,
Cloud Messaging, and you want to
yes.
know, should you port to FCM?
Actually, I use Firebase, and I find all data I stored or saved actually in Google Cloud. So I just want to confirm the relationship between these two platforms, actually.
Okay, so I'll answer your second question first. So it
So-
turns out that Firebase is, you could think of it as a layer on top of Google Cloud. So it turns out all Firebase projects are also Google Cloud projects.
So if I deploy my project, should I do something based on Google Cloud or Firebase?
Well, that depends on what you need. So Google Cloud offerings tend to be like enterprise, like massively scalable kinds of things. Firebase tends to be things like, for mobile apps, so like special SDKs for mobile apps. So I mentioned earlier, cloud storage for Firebase is Google Cloud Storage. They're the same product. Firebase offers SDKs on top of that. So if you already have a storage bucket and you want to access from your mobile app, you don't have to do anything special other than use the client SDK. So each different product has its own unique relationship to cloud. Some things used to come from Google Play services, so like app indexing and cloud messaging had roots in Play services, at least on Android. iOS is a different thing. But cloud messaging is also a unique situation where there's Google Cloud Messaging and there's Firebase Cloud Messaging. And it turns out in that case, it's the exact same backend. GCM is FCM, but FCM is sort of like the next gen of that, and we're pushing people to upgrade or move to Firebase Cloud Messaging. The benefits of that, actually, it's better, easier client SDK integration, and I'll speak for Android because on Android, setting up GCM was a nightmare, right? It was very complicated, a lot of steps to do. With FCM, the number of steps have been drastically reduced. It's so much easier. And if you're using FCM, now you can send messages directly to users from the Firebase console. With GCM, you couldn't do that. You had to write code on your backend to figure out who you want to send the message to and use the API to send messages. So you can still use that API. That API still exists. It's just that now that Firebase adds a lot of extra features on top of that. So I personally recommend that you move. Google wants everyone to move to FCM, but GCM isn't going away anytime soon. Like that's going to continue to be supported for people who don't want to migrate right away. Thank you. Any other questions? All right, cool. Well, we'll get Johnny up here then. Let's hear it for Johnny Diamond.